She was happy with the work she'd done, so she looked at me and smiled as she asked, "Was that incredible? So, when do we meet again?" I chuckled and replied, "I'll call you soon." She leaned over and picked up the stack of $100 bills from the nightstand. She paused for a moment, as her eyes fell on the smaller stack nearby. "Take it as a tip," I told her. With a grin, she scooped up the extra cash and gave me a quick peck on the cheek just before she left. She reached the door and turned back to say, "Merry Christmas." Her cold, transactional look shattered any illusion I might have held alone in that Las Vegas hotel room. I was hit by a feeling of emptiness. I realized there wasn't any love, no companionship, just a costly escape. "Merry Christmas," I muttered under my breath as I rolled over and drifted off. When I woke up, I went over the weekend's events. Even with last night's splurge, I still had a $3,000 profit from blackjack. I made a profit of $500 from blackjack, which was what I'd aimed for. I was aiming for $5,000 by the end of the week, but now the challenge was steeper. Every Vegas trip followed my strict playbook: no drinking, no gambling when tired, staying unnoticed, spreading bets across casinos and leaving as soon as I reached my target. I had my own tricks, altering my look, shifting goals and avoiding high-stakes tables. I like the $10 minimum bets. Sometimes I deliberately lose, make dumb plays, order a drink and act like just another reckless gambler. I never cashed in all my chips. I kept my chips in one place, which meant the staff didn't notice me. But I knew they'd eventually catch on and kick me out. I was good at counting cards because I had a knack for numbers and a memory that never missed a detail. Casinos saw that as cheating, but I'd started because I needed money. Now I was trying to get back what I'd lost. I knew some things were gone for good, like my career and Sandra. Once I'd been a respected math professor, but now every decision it was a constant internal debate. Should I play or should I fold? Sandra's betrayal and arrival had rocked my world. Thinking about it, I wondered how much longer I could keep bluffing in this game. I recalled my first day at the university, stepping onto that vast campus as a new assistant professor, feeling completely lost, trying to find the math department. A student finally helped me and I made my way through the maze of offices to meet the head of the department, Dr. Henry Marshall. After a hesitant knock on his door, I heard he boomed a welcome from behind a desk piled high with papers. He was an older man with a wide smile. "You must be Andy. Hungry? Let's grab some food and a Guinness." That was my first encounter with Dr. Marshall. We had lunch together and had a few beers. He told me to call him Hank and introduced me to nearly everyone in the department. The next morning, I was a bit hungover and uncertain about everything. I returned to his office. Hank never wanted to lower his voice. He went over my course load and gave me an in-depth rundown of the campus. I gave him a quick rundown of campus dynamics. The English department has a bit of a rivalry with the Spanish department. The French department doesn't have many students, and the German department is like a mythological creature. I've seen a few Oriental languages, but the chemistry department gets along with biology, but not with botany. Astronomy is a bit of a standalone department. Back history, it's got its own agenda, and political science is a real rabble-rouser. The sports teams are terrible, but they're rolling in money. He said he was amused at lunch and took me to a local biker bar where he was a regular. He's known for restoring motorcycles. His current project is a 1940 Indian Chief, which everyone there was eagerly anticipating after an afternoon of. We had a good chat and a few beers. I went home, half joking about whether my liver would survive Hank's mentorship. The next morning, I was still a bit foggy, but I found my way back to Hank's office. "Andy, I was about 50-50 on whether you'd show up with a tattoo today." He joked and seemed pleased. He dove right into discussing the student orientation and his hands-on approach. He gave me his take on each classroom, and it was pretty interesting. He said the acoustics in my main room are terrible, but the lousy heating will keep them awake. He also explained that the location of one's office indicates their rank within the department. We saw the maintenance guy painting down the hall. Hank was clearly annoyed when he saw the worker unlocking the door to what was marked as Dr. Evan Doyle's office. The worker replied that he'd been told Hank had reallocated the office. Hank was frustrated but calm and told him to unlock the door. Inside the office was decked out with plush furniture, stylish decor, and the latest equipment, including a brand new computer. Hank looked around, then turned to me and said, "It looks like Dr. Doyle used his whole budget on redecorating." "Well done, Andy." He then told the worker to change the locks and ensured Dr. Doyle had no access. "Nobody's moving a thing without my approval." He also said the name plate will read Dr. Andy Miller. As we walked away, Hank added, "I've placed you right in the middle of a power struggle with our associate professor, but don't worry, he'll learn his lesson." I frowned, realizing I hadn't met Dr. Doyle yet. That's because he ignored my invitation to the meet and greet. He probably thought he was above it. Hank chuckled on Thursday while working in my new office. I heard the door handle rattle. I opened it to see an angry man glaring at me. "What are you doing in my office?" he demanded. I replied, extending a hand in greeting. "I'm Andy Miller, the new assistant professor. You must be Dr. Doyle. Why are you in my office?" Doyle ignored my hand and repeated, "Why are you in my office?" Dr. Marshall assigned this space to me along with the furnishings. Dr. Marshall told me to, so I said, "I'll be out in 10 minutes, and went over to Hank's office. Hank's secretary, Deb, had seen the whole thing, so Hank was ready when Doyle turned up 30 minutes later. Doyle came back and said, "I'm here to collect my stuff," in a really angry way. Dr. Marshall had said he was the only person who could authorize that. Removals. I told him, which prompted another outburst from Doyle. Finally, I suggested that we have lunch with Dr. Marshall to sort this out. Doyle shot back with a bitter, "Forget it. I'm out of here." I locked my office and made my way to Hank's office. He promised to introduce me to the best burger joint in town. As I bit into the burger, I had to admit it was the best I'd ever tasted. Over a beer, "Hank, I had to tell you." We also chatted about Doyle's recent antics. It was clear we wouldn't be on his Christmas card list on Saturday. Hank hosted a gathering at his home for faculty. I arrived early with wine and was welcomed by his wife Maggie. She was very welcoming and introduced me to everyone. Maggie shared stories about Hank that made me respect him even more. They told me that they couldn't have children, which was a challenge that had brought them closer together, but also left them wondering about what could have been. At one point, she said that Hank thought of me as a son, which really touched me. Well, only Maggie can get folks all teary-eyed. Hank laughed, came up behind us, and then led me to his spotless workshop, where he showed off his meticulously restored. He said proudly that a bike like this deserves a second chance. He explained how it went from being a scrapyard relic to a gleaming masterpiece. I agreed. As the night went on, Maggie kissed me on the cheek and invited me to have dinner with them anytime. Hank added with a wink that he already saw too much of me during the week, so no weekend visits. "I might let you help me restore my latest bike project on Saturdays." In that first semester, I relied a lot on Hank's guidance and soon regarded him as a mentor. We started having a lunch together every Thursday, and by the second week, he insisted on paying. I started to find my footing in the classroom, getting to grips with theorems and the material. Numbers had always been my strength. I was known as a maths nerd back in high school, through to my undergrad, master's, and doctorate. I turned down various job offers to take up an assistant professorship, where I could focus on research with Hank. We spent long afternoons working through equations and eventually published a paper offering new insights into the Hodge conjecture. The paper sparked debates and brought, despite Dr. Evan Doyle openly criticizing our work, I continued to refine our research, often using Hank as a sounding board. When my office was moved next to Hank's, it was a sign that I was being groomed for his position when he retired. However, Doyle opposed gaining tenure, accusing me of favoritism. Hank was accused of favoritism. An independent review cleared Hank, but the whole ordeal clearly took a toll on him. When I became an associate professor, my previous position opened up again to avoid further criticism. Hank formed a hiring committee which included Doyle. Doyle resisted any candidate who had shown support for either Hank or me. Then Sandra Perry entered the scene. She had impressive credentials and Sandra Perry was a great addition to the team. She had the perfect blend of charm and competence, and she was a great fit for the role. Hank and I agreed she'd be a good choice, and we were both happy when she was selected as the new assistant professor. At the meeting, I joked with Hank that he should give her my cold, drafty classroom. He raised an eyebrow, and I added, "Every guy in the room is going to need a cold shower." I kept my classroom, but Sandra got my freshman courses. At Hank and Maggie's annual party, I noticed Sandra alone, her wine glass empty. I introduced myself, saying, "Hi, I'm Andy Miller." She smiled and responded, "Hello, Dr. Miller. It's a pleasure to work with you. Call me Andy." I offered, "Miller suits you." She replied, "Call me Sandra." "Andy, you're more than just my poor lunch buddy now." Hank joined us, chuckling. "Andy, you're more than just my poor lunch buddy now." He then offered Sandra a tour of the party, adding, "Let's go track down my wife in this crowd." Watching them walk off, I couldn't help but feel a void throughout the evening. I found excuses to cross paths with Sandra, making small talk each time. After a while, I got her another glass of wine and saw her talking to Doyle. She thanked me for the wine, but Doyle gave me a dirty look and ended the conversation. I didn't want to cause a fuss, so I went over to Maggie, who seemed to agree with me. I watched Sandra and Doyle, who were looking unhappy. Doyle's never been to one of our parties before. She said it was obvious why he came. "Where's Hank?" I asked. "I'm in the shop, disgusted with Doyle," she replied. "Are you going to join him?" she asked. "I'm not," I said, "but tell Hank I'll meet him tomorrow at the office. We can work on that BSA bike in the evening." Saturday came. Even though I was at the office, I couldn't stop thinking about Sandra. I was frustrated, so I went to Hank's workshop. "It's about time you showed up," Hank teased. "I thought you'd be replaced by a new mechanic." Sandra was there, dressed casually, clearly just enjoying Hank's company. Sandra and Maggie decided we should all go out to eat, and it's your treat. Hank continued with a laugh. We agreed and headed to a cozy Italian restaurant that overlooked the usual dress code for Hank, who was a regular. The bill was steep, but sitting next to Sandra made every penny worth it. Later at a jazz bar, I asked Sandra to dance as we swayed. She leaned back and said I should be mad at you. "Why?" "You asked," and she replied. I was confused. "You left me with Doyle. He made my skin crawl and told me to follow him home." I apologized, and she softened, saying I could make it up to her by taking her out on Friday. Doyle often tried to disrupt our work. He even tried to offer his help, but Doyle's efforts to drive a wedge between us failed after that school year. Sandra and I got married and were happily married for 4 years. I enjoyed my work, my friendship with Hank, and even managed to restore a 1969 Harley-Davidson. The only remaining challenge was the Hodge conjecture, which still eluded me. One day, feeling frustrated with my calculations, I began thinking about how to make maths more engaging for kids. It struck me that elementary education was falling short, especially in maths. That's when I got the idea to create entertainment maths shows for children. Using on that Saturday night, we went to Hank's place to grill steaks after dinner. I brought up the idea with the guys. The way we're teaching math to kids is failing them. We need to make fun, engaging shows that cover the basics. I explained how we could use the university's broadcasting setup and bring in well-known figures to make math enjoyable. We decided to get well-known figures involved to make maths more fun. Hank and Sandra were really excited about the idea. I thought they'd make a great co-hosts. Once everything was up and running, the show was a hit and got picked up for nationwide syndication, which brought in revenue for the university and a share for Hank, Sandra, and me. Hank and Sandra became recognizable figures while I worked mostly behind the scenes, writing episodes. This break from the Hodge conjecture was a welcome change of pace. I also wrote a few maths textbooks, and Sandra and I started talking about having kids. She thought the timing wasn't quite right though. Then Hank said he was leaving to become emeritus and suggested I take his place. I felt a bit proud and sad at the idea of taking his place, but I prepared for the promotion process at the open hearing. I thought things were going well. Then Ray's former student came forward with a shocking accusation against me. She said I'd coerced her into an affair. I denied it, but the committee let her speak. I saw Sandra's tearful face and felt devastated. Ray's roommates backed her up, and Sandra left the room before they'd even finished. When it was my turn, I denied the allegations and demanded an investigation, but it was too late. The committee decided against my promotion. I left the hearing and found that Sandra had packed her things and was gone. I went straight to Hank. He was shocked and outraged, encouraging me to fight back. But my focus was on finding Sandra. Despite all my efforts, I couldn't locate her. On top of that, the university appointed Doyle as interim department head and took my office away from me weeks later. I got a call from Maggie. Hank had died of a heart attack before I could get to the hospital. The funeral was a blur of grief, and afterwards, Maggie decided to move to Florida to be near her sister. I felt utterly alone, not long after Doyle was officially promoted to Hank's former position. He called me into his office and made me wait for 2 hours before accusing me of plagiarism. When I asked who had made the allegation, he smirked and said, "Your wife, Sandra." Another committee was formed, this time chaired by the dean, to investigate the claims. I brought an attorney and anxiously awaited Sandra's testimony. When she entered, she glared at me with pure hatred as I tried to speak. My lawyer told me to stay quiet, and Sandra said that I'd stolen research from Doyle with Hank's help. My lawyer tried to get her to change her story, but she just finished without even looking at me. A couple of weeks later, I was fired for plagiarism. Then, 2 weeks after that, I got divorce papers from the deposition. I just couldn't stop myself from going over and talking to her, and I got in trouble for it. I was given a contempt citation by the judge. Eventually, the divorce went through, with Sandra taking 65% of our assets, the house, and 2 years of alimony. She left the courtroom, and Doyle was there to console her. Sandra even sued me for the rights to the TV show. I threw the papers down, got on my bike, and rode aimlessly. I didn't attend the hearings, so I assumed she won by default, given everything I'd worked for. I was out of work and had no options left in academia or business. I thought about taking on manual labor, but I didn't have the right skills for that. I decided to try my luck in the casino scene. I watched the games for hours and concluded that blackjack had the best odds. If I could master a system, I could make money from it. I started cautiously, observing other players, and then began to play. After 6 hours, I was up $3. I checked into a casino hotel and crashed for the night. The next day, I started learning more about blackjack, picking up tips about comps, player cards, and other techniques. I realized I needed to switch casinos regularly to avoid attracting too much attention. As I traveled between casinos, my earnings grew, and I managed to keep up with the alimony payments. I mailed them through the postal service. I used money orders and included notes begging Sandra to contact me, but she never responded. I converted my winnings into rare coins at coin shops after flights. I kept a small bank account to show a traceable income for the IRS, but I left as little trace as possible. I had some savings, but it wasn't nearly enough to retire on. 3 years passed since I felt like a real disgrace. When the alimony ended, I woke up the day after Christmas next to an escort I had hired on Pulse. I'd called Maggie the night before to wish her a Merry Christmas. It was a call that threw me off. I said, "Oh, Andy, it's so good to hear from you. You should spend the holidays with me." She said. I laughed. "Santa and I don't exactly mix. How are you, honey?" I was worried when I heard the news. She added a note of concern in her voice. I frowned. "What news, Maggie?" After a long pause, she said, "Forgive me, Andy. I thought you were calling to commiserate." Sandra remarried. Her voice broke, and I was speechless. I'd held on to some hope that maybe one day Sandra might forgive me and remarried. I asked, feeling numb, "Who did she marry?" "Andy, it doesn't matter. Let it go, please. She pleaded, but I insisted. Finally, she said it was Doyle. They had a baby last month. I muttered that I had to go and hung up. Maggie tried calling back immediately, but I ignored it and went straight to the bar. I ordered top-shelf bourbon and called for an escort. I downed it in 3 years without indulgence, and I could hardly believe Sandra had moved on. I had a few glasses of bourbon until the escort arrived, agreed on a price, and found a strange comfort in the company of a stranger. The next morning, I was hungover and drained, so I showered and headed to the lobby bar. I usually avoid drinking when gambling, but today I was making an exception. I planned to drink, hydrate, and rest while I was sipping a Bloody Mary, watching the bustling crowd. Someone sat beside me. I looked over and saw Meredith, a friendly brunette blackjack dealer from the casino. She was great with newbies and could handle tough players with ease. I always enjoyed her shifts. I'd often tipped her well, sometimes even playing a hand in her name for extra tips. We hadn't exchanged words before, but we'd recognized each other in her uniform, dark pants, white shirt. She was wearing a dark shirt, dark vest, and name tag. She smiled briefly before ordering. "Hey Meredith, will it be the bartender?" "Hey, it's just a 7-Up, no ice," she replied. Frank placed her drink on a napkin. Oddly, she added another napkin beneath it. She drank quickly and slipped out, brushing her cup against mine as she left. I found it a bit rude, but let it go when I reached for my empty cup. I noticed a message scrolled on the napkin beneath it. "They are watching you." My pulse quickened, but I stayed calm, covering the napkin. I motioned to the bartender to clear the glass with my hand and pretended to clean my glasses. I discreetly pocketed the napkin and left some cash for my drink. I wasn't sure if I was actually under surveillance, so I exited without incident. Back in my hotel room, I read the message again and then flushed the napkin. I decided to avoid gambling for the time being and hoped that a shift in my routine might either make the casino act or lose interest if they were watching me. I spent the day letting the TV play as I was listening to the background noise and changing channels without really paying much attention. The next morning, I was still unsure, but I knew I had to contact Meredith somewhere away from the casino's watchful eyes. I watched her shift and noticed she took the number 7 bus to get home. The next day, I rode several buses to check if I was being followed, but it seemed like no one was trailing me. 20 minutes before her shift ended, I got on the number 7 bus. When I got on, I whispered, "We need to talk." Her eyes, she recognized me and got off the bus at the next stop. I followed her into an IHOP, where we found a table. She spoke first. She said, "I thought you'd left town." I leaned forward, eager to know more. "Who are they? Why are they watching me?" She settled back in her chair. "You know why they think you're counting cards. Then why haven't they done the same to me?" I asked. "They're not certain yet," she replied. "They're watching to be sure you don't fit the usual profile. You play at low-stakes tables, you don't make big moves even when the odds are in your favor, and sometimes you even make dumb bets and lose money." Just then, the waitress came by and we placed our orders while waiting. I thought of more questions. How did they even notice me? I asked. "It's hard to say," she replied. "You're just on their radar." "How did you find out about it?" I pressed. She sighed. "They asked me to keep an eye on you." I studied her for a moment. "So why warn me?" She hesitated, then said, "I started working at I was saving up to go to college, but then I got pregnant and my boyfriend turned abusive. I left him and had a tough time for a few years. I reported a lucky player to security, and they took him away. I got a raise afterwards, but I heard rumors about what happened to him. I didn't want that kind of guilt on my conscience again." Our food arrived, and as we began to eat, I looked at her. "How can I trust you?" She held my gaze. "You can't." After we finished, we ordered more coffee, "So I'm on their radar but not in trouble?" I asked. She confirmed. I slumped back, considering my bleak prospects. "What's wrong?" she asked. This was my last shot. Gambling was supposed to be my way out. "Why?" I asked. I explained my life story and the scandals that led me here. After a pause, she suggested, "Why not switch to poker?" "I don't know how to play poker," I admitted. She looked at me, surprised. "You've been making money at blackjack, but you don't know poker." I shrugged. "Blackjack is simple. You just beat the dealer or let them bust. I've never learned poker. In poker, you're up against other players, not the house." She explained that casinos don't care if people count cards at poker tables. Plus, poker is played with one deck per hand. I considered the benefits and said, "I'll teach you." She looked doubtful, and then she said, "You leave in a few weeks?" I said, "Right." She asked, "Do you think you can make it worth my while?" I replied, "I'll rent an apartment in your name for a year, paid up front, plus $500 a month for lessons. I'll cover all expenses, so no rent or daycare costs. That's $6,000. She thought it over carefully, then finally nodded and said, "Deal." The next day, after her shift, I met Meredith to help her and her daughter move out of the trailer park at 7 p.m. I drove into the park, feeling a bit uneasy. I parked up and went over to Meredith and her daughter, who were waiting by the stairs. They were carrying a lot of bags. They got in and Meredith told me to get moving. I drove off quickly, and her little girl was clinging to her mum, looking scared. I asked Meredith if this was everything I'd asked for. She said it was, but that there wasn't anything decent left. That was my first real glimpse into the challenges they'd faced. After a quick drive, we got to the apartment I'd arranged. I gave Meredith the key and they carried their bags inside. The little girl was excited to explore the empty rooms. Meredith told me how their stuff had been stolen bit by bit, and all they had left was what fit in those bags. There was only one room with furniture, and her daughter noticed. Meredith introduced her to me, and after an initial shyness, "I thought you'd have more stuff," I said, glancing at the empty rooms. I told them tonight that you and Pamela can take my room. I'll sleep on the floor out here tomorrow week. We'll get some furniture." Meredith was a bit reluctant at first, but she agreed in the end. They went off to the room and locked the door behind them. I settled down on the living room floor, spending the night in discomfort. In the morning, I woke up and saw Pamela staring at me. She quickly scurried away. Meredith asked, "Did you sleep?" I stretched, trying to ease the stiffness. I replied sarcastically, "Like a rock." Pamela's stomach growled, and I realized I hadn't stocked the kitchen. "Let's grab some breakfast, then pick up furniture and groceries for your shift tonight," I suggested at a diner. Pamela ate hungrily, and Meredith, looking embarrassed, explained their financial struggles. I told her she didn't need to explain. Pamela beamed when I suggested getting blueberry muffins to go at the furniture store. Meredith gravitated towards the cheapest options, but I insisted on something better. Eventually, she chose a modest, "Well, we got a bedroom set." Pamela was really excited about the idea of a queen-sized bed. "We got a bed and a dresser for her, but what about the living room and kitchen?" I asked, getting the debate started again. Meredith said we didn't need anything fancy, but I stood my ground. "If you don't choose, I'll let Pamela pick." I joked, which made Pamela laugh. Meredith finally picked out some comfortable, simple pieces. I paid in cash and got a small discount, and then we headed to Costco for kitchen essentials, linens, and a few other items. I noticed Pamela admiring the electronics section, so I suggested Meredith and Pamela handle the groceries while I picked up the other items. I knew it was pointless to argue, so I just went ahead and did it. They grabbed another cart when I caught up with them at checkout. Meredith eyed me suspiciously. "Where'd you go?" she asked. "Impulse shopping," I said. She gave me a grin that seemed to say she was sorry, but I told her not to worry, and we pushed our loaded carts to the van. A passerby joked that we must have spent a fortune at the store, and I replied, "That's about how much it costs to keep the kid fed." Pamela laughed when we got back to the apartment. We all pitched in to unload the van, and Meredith surprised me with her strength. We got everything inside just fine. Entertainment center complete with a 42 inches TV and Xbox and games. Meredith gave me a mock glare as Pamela cheered. So that's why you disappeared. Meredith teased. Was it because Pamela was beside herself with excitement? This is part of my teaching method. I joked. I'll be rewarded when Pamela learns her lessons. Pamela immediately started exploring each game with wide-eyed enthusiasm. Meredith left to get ready for work, and when she returned, she found me and Pamela on the floor putting together the new furniture. I turned it into a maths lesson, with Pamela counting screws and calculating parts. Meredith watched in amazement as we worked together. I said, all my life, I've wanted to teach. She shook her head slightly, said goodbye and headed to work. I spent the rest of the day putting it together. The furniture was great for reinforcing Pamela's math skills while we worked. By the time Meredith returned, I had her bedroom set up. I knew she'd probably rearrange things, but I figured the effort might make her smile. I had burgers on the grill so Meredith could relax and enjoy listening to Pamela's enthusiastic retelling of our day after dinner. Meredith gave Pamela a bath and put her to bed while I cleaned up the kitchen. When Meredith returned in an oversized t-shirt and sweats, she looked effortlessly beautiful. Thanks for setting up my room. She looked great in a shirt and sweats. Thanks for setting up my room, she said with a smile. I hope you don't mind if I change things around a bit. We both laughed, and as we sat down, I showed her the nanny cams and explained how to access the feed. She looked at me seriously. If I thought for a second that, if you'd hurt my child, we wouldn't be here. Your offer has been a lifeline for us, but if I'd had any doubts, we would have stayed in that place. Now that you've been teaching Pam all day, it's time you learned something. She pulled out a deck of cards and shuffled. We started with. We played 5-card draw poker, with her explaining the rankings of different hands from a royal flush down to the high card. I grasped the concepts easily and understood the odds. We played late into the night, with her winning consistently. Finally, she called it a night, saying she needed sleep. I headed to bed feeling frustrated that poker didn't come as naturally to me as I'd hoped. It didn't come as naturally as I'd hoped, but I was oddly comforted by the lingering scent of her perfume on the sheets. The next morning, I awoke to the aroma of bacon and eggs. Stumbling out of bed, I found Pamela at the table counting Cheerios and practicing her addition and subtraction before eating. Meredith was at the stove setting the table with a warm smile. Seeing them together in that simple domestic scene struck me. It was the kind of life I'd been missing. Up until then, I'd been eating alone in public, which was a bit sad. But Meredith's smile made me feel better. I sat down and tried to join in the conversation, but Meredith noticed something was off after breakfast. I kept myself busy with Pamela's maths games to avoid any questions from her before leaving for work. Meredith gently asked if I was old. I said I was, but I was actually lying to reassure her. Weeks went by in this routine. Breakfast lessons with Pamela. Meredith off to work. More lessons. Dinner. Pamela's bedtime. Then poker training. We worked through various games. I picked up the rules, but I kept losing. It made me doubt my investment in this arrangement, but I stuck with it. One night while playing Texas Hold'em, I got a royal flush, but before I could place a bet, Meredith folded. Frustrated, I asked how she'd guessed my hand. She explained that I'd been giving away subtle tells. The tells that revealed what I was holding that night marked the start of advanced lessons focused on reading opponents, bluffing and refining my strategy. Over the next 2 months, I continued teaching Pamela, who excelled in everything from basic math to early algebra. Meredith was worried she might be bored at school, but I assured her that Pamela would thrive when the time came for Pamela's school orientation. Meredith took the day off and asked me to join them. I could see how nervous she was, hovering over Pamela like a protective mum. Pamela, though, seemed thrilled and eager to join her new classmates just before class began. She surprised us both by giving me a big hug. I encouraged her, and she joined the other kids afterwards. Meredith wiped away tears, and I suggested we spend the day at a park rather than head home. We wandered around the park, enjoying ice cream and sitting quietly on a bench, slowly. Meredith told us how she and Pamela ended up in Las Vegas. She said that she grew up with a father who struggled with addiction and that she was kicked out of the house at 18. She then moved to Vegas, met Arthur, and got pregnant. While Meredith worked at a casino, Arthur stayed home drinking and eventually got involved with meth. Things escalated until he became abusive. After a police raid, he even threatened her from jail. She took Pamela and moved to a rundown trailer park. To survive, tears began streaming down her face as she shared her fears about losing Pamela. I dropped my ice cream and put my arms around her as she cried. Some passers-by looked at us with curiosity, assuming I was the cause of her distress. I reassured her, reminding her of her strength. She looked up at me with tear-streaked eyes and asked, "Do you think I'm beautiful?" She was vulnerable yet defiant. I replied, feeling my heart pound. "You're one of the most beautiful, desirable women I know. You're the most beautiful, desirable woman I know. I only wish I had a chance with you." She blinked, surprised. "Why haven't you told me before?" she asked. I hesitated. "I'm just a washed-up professor, surviving off casino wins. I have nothing to offer, and I'm a lot older than you. You and Pamela deserve better. Living with you has been the best part of my life. Now I've probably messed that up by saying this." She smiled. "You finally went against your logical brain and took a chance. That was the right move." We kissed deeply until a police officer approached to check if everything was all right. After explaining, we both laughed and felt a new bond growing between us. Living together, we grew closer, even with Pamela around. She noticed the changes and asked to spend more time together as a family. My confidence grew as my understanding of human behavior improved. Eventually, Meredith told me to test my skills. I went to the casino with Meredith an hour after she started her shift. I was itching to play blackjack, but I saw a security guard watching me, so I changed my mind and went to the poker tables instead. I spent a week watching the players, noting their mannerisms and strategies. When I shared my insights with Meredith, she said the casino was still waiting to see what I could do. Meredith wanted to keep up with our training. We tried to make progress in our relationship when Pamela was asleep, but the physical tension between us was growing. I joked about letting Pamela have a sleepover with friends, but Meredith laughed, saying that was a few years off. We settled into our routine, trying to manage our building frustrations and watch the poker players each night. I began to recognize patterns: the loud braggarts, the cautious strategists, and so on. There were the quiet pros, the superstitious types, and the charming women who played on their looks. I could pick up on most players, but a few seasoned pros remained mysteries. I knew I had to get into the game soon, as my resources were thinning. I planned to sit in on a 110 SL20 Hold'em game that Friday night, a time when Meredith would be home with Pamela, so they could have Saturday together, rested and ready. I went straight to the poker section when I entered the casino. I saw the usual escort coming to lead me to the table. I took my seat, hoping Meredith was right and that the casino would leave me alone as long as I played clean. I bought in and studied the faces around the table, wondering who would turn out to be the sucker in this game. By Saturday afternoon, I'd have a good idea. I stumbled back to the apartment where Meredith and Pamela were watching a Pixar movie. Meredith looked up with concern. She'd asked, so I tossed her an envelope. She was really happy and gave me a big hug and kiss. Pamela, who was still at the table, joined in the hug. I told Pamela she could choose the restaurant for dinner. We ended up at Chuck E. Cheese's. After ordering, Pamela went off to play while Meredith asked me about the game. "It went really well," I said. "You trained me well. I saw the game unfold like a chessboard. I wasn't the biggest winner, but I did pretty well." A pro at the table recognized. I was pretty good at the game, and we didn't get in each other's way. The security guys didn't hassle me, so I cashed out and came home. Meredith nuzzled against me and said, "Half of this is yours." I handed her a portion of the winnings, and I told her, "You went above and beyond to get me here. We're partners now." Meredith's eyes welled up, but before she could respond, our food arrived, and Pamela rejoined us under the table. I felt Meredith's foot sliding up and down my leg, her silent signal of connection. To make sure gambling didn't get in the way of our lives, Meredith and I set some ground rules. I could only play when Pamela was busy or with Meredith. I'd buy in with a set amount, never chase losses, and any profits would go into a shared account. We made a commitment to a weekly family activity, and our physical relationship grew more intense, though we remained cautious with Pamela around. When I entered a satellite poker tournament and won $225, we celebrated with an Italian dinner, which Meredith chose this time. Back at the apartment, Pamela went to bed, and Meredith and I started our usual cuddling on the couch. Then she surprised me by saying she wanted to play poker. "Meredith, you've got to be kidding. I'm all worked up and now you want to play cards?" I said, incredulous. She grinned, kissed me, then strolled to the kitchen table and grabbed a deck of cards as she shuffled. An old worry nagged at me. Andy noticed that I was uneasy. Every time I shuffled, I got that look and a feeling I couldn't shake. I told him, "Let's keep your mind off that." And we started playing strip poker. The only sound was the cards as she dealt. She announced she was all in, and I called her bet with a terrible hand, a deuce and an ace. She stood and peeled off her clothes, revealing her flawless figure. Her eyes were a mix of excitement and vulnerability. When I undressed, she seemed pleased. We moved on. I took her to my room, and she was everything I'd hoped for. Her voice rose in breathless gasps as she clung to me, whispering, "Forgive me if I don't get this right. The only person I've been with is Arthur." I reassured her, and we continued. When it was over, we cuddled. However, as dawn approached, Meredith returned to Pamela's room. Despite my frustration, I knew this was the beginning of something deeper between us. Our evenings became explorations of each other's desires. We rarely went to sleep unsatisfied. We thought we were keeping our relationship under wraps, but one stormy night Pamela asked to sleep in our bed. Thanks to us being clothed, we comforted her through the night. The next morning over breakfast, Pamela revealed she'd known for weeks. "I just don't get why Mum can't stay in one bed all night," she said, setting us off laughing as the World Series of Poker approached. I grew nervous about media attention, but fortunately ESPN focused on the high. I was surprised to find that some of the top players were not as well known as I'd expected. I was dealt pocket aces and played cautiously, building the pot with a few calls. I was then dealt 2 more aces and a king of clubs, giving me 4 of a kind. Some players went all in, and I followed suit, noticing the cameras zooming in on us. The other players revealed their hands, which were a mix of pairs and a full house, but none could top my quads. I didn't change a thing and I quadrupled my stack right there, taking control of the table. By the end of the first day, I was one of the chip leaders. I was exhausted, but Meredith greeted me and was thrilled by my progress. She took care of me with food and a back massage before tucking me into bed. On the second day, I was moved to a new table, still in the lead. My confidence grew as I used my position to put pressure on the others. By the day's end, I'd increased my chip. I kept going, leaving other players frustrated in my wake. Soon, I was getting more attention. An associate producer asked for an interview, and I agreed because it was part of the contract. The interview was tense. I was curt and didn't give much away, which left the interviewer flustered. As I left, I overheard someone asking why I'd been so difficult back at the apartment. I warned Meredith that trouble might be brewing. She told me to ignore it and focus on the game. Then, there was a media report. I was branded as the disgraced professor leading the World Series of Poker. My past scandals were now public knowledge. Some players tried to get under my skin with it, but I managed to keep my composure and continued winning. The situation escalated when a news crew ambushed Meredith and Pam on their way to school, firing questions until Meredith retreated with Pamela. They kept this from me to protect my focus, but the stress on them was building while I quietly rose through. Meredith and Pamela were feeling the heat. Meredith was even questioned at work, and Pamela faced teasing at school. Finally, I reached the final table. The tournament paused for additional TV coverage, and I agreed to a brief factual statement about my past without taking any live questions. I recounted my story, apologizing for my behavior in the previous interview and explaining my desire to protect Meredith and Pamela. I ended with a plea for privacy for when I got home, my family, and I tried to relax a bit, knowing that the final cash prize could be pretty substantial. My interview aired on multiple networks, and to my surprise, a persistent reporter found and spoke with Maggie, who confirmed my side of the story. Eventually, the reporter even tried tracking down my accusers, though I wouldn't learn about this until later. For now, all I wanted was to enjoy some time with Meredith and Pamela before the tournament resumed. I suggested a trip we went to the Grand Canyon and packed a picnic. We spent a peaceful day there before heading back to the apartment. Pamela ran inside ahead of us while Meredith and I grabbed our things from the car. I had a strange feeling, but before I could fully process it, I heard Pamela scream. Meredith and I rushed in and saw a tall, disheveled man holding Pamela. He was holding a large hunting knife near her. "Damn it, Meredith! I'll end her if you don't back off!" he shouted, terrified. Meredith took a step back, pleading, "Please, Arthur, don't hurt her." It was Arthur. He'd found us. He'd broken in, ransacking the place for cash. "I want the money," he sneered. "Give me all of it, and maybe you and this little brat will live." He'd leave a mark on her, but she'd live. Mare trembled and tried to explain that the tournament chips weren't actual cash and that we hadn't received anything yet, but Arthur wasn't having it. Listening to the drugs had him fixated on every plea from Meredith, who seemed to only rile him up more. I knew I had to step in. "Arthur, I'm the one you're after. I'll give you everything I've got, just let Pamela go," I said, keeping my voice steady and recognizing him. Arthur sneered, "I know you. You're the pathetic bastard who took her from me. Do you want her? Then you're going to pay." Pamela struggled in his grip, and he raised the knife close to her face. I lunged, grabbing his wrist and forcing him. To get Pamela out of there, she broke free and ran to Meredith. I yelled, "Run!" I tried to get Arthur to let her go, but he was stronger. He lashed out with his strength, which had built up in prison. The knife cut across my skin, but I held my ground, buying time for Meredith and Pamela to escape. I was bleeding, but I kept blocking the door to protect them. Arthur enjoyed tormenting me. He traced painful lines across my skin with his knife as my strength waned. He seemed to sense it was time to leave. I tackled him, but he struck back, pinning me down. My vision blurred and I felt myself slipping. I'd failed too many times in life and now I was failing them. The last thing I saw was Arthur's gloating face as he prepared for the final blow. Then I heard Pamela's voice, clear and desperate. "Don't hurt my daddy." Her words cut deeper than any wound, and I clung to them with everything I had left. A sharp jolting shock surged through me. I blacked out. I was woken up by an annoying, persistent beeping. My mind struggled to place it until I opened my eyes and saw the stark white ceiling tiles above me. Voices murmured around me. I heard people say, "He's coming around." There was a buzz of activity. Then I felt Meredith's warm, soft hand gripping mine as she cried over me. I tried to speak, but she just smiled through her tears, shaking her head. When I woke up again, Meredith was still there, holding my hand. Was in the intensive care unit. She told me I'd lost a lot of blood and needed stitches, but I'd be okay. It seemed the police had tossed both of us before Arthur could finish me off. I'd soon be moved to a regular room. I tried to talk, but I couldn't, and I drifted back to sleep. The next time I woke up, I was in a different room with Meredith still by my side. She looked utterly exhausted. I told her she needed to go home and rest, but she refused, saying she and Pamela was coping well when she was mentioned. However, memories of her screams surfaced, and my face twisted with pain. The last thing I heard was Pamela begging Arthur not to hurt her daddy. I thought we'd become a family, but losing that was the hardest thing to accept. "Listen," Meredith said firmly, "we are a family. Pamela was crying for you. You know how I know. You told me to go home, not just to the apartment, but anywhere we're together. That's what home is to us." Before I could respond, Pamela jumped up. Pamela ran into bed and started crying. "Daddy, Daddy!" I wrapped my arms around her, and the three of us held each other. Tears were flowing freely. The nurses gave us some time alone after we calmed down. Meredith updated me. Arthur's actions had been caught on the nanny cams, securing a long prison sentence for him. The video had even made national news. The World Series of Poker organizers had contacted Meredith to ask if I could continue. She left it up to me. "What do you think, Meredith? I could go back or just give it up?" I asked. She smiled, her voice soft but steady. "I'm just glad you asked. This is your decision. Your family is behind you 100%. And so, despite being a bit battered, I found myself back at the final table, determined to see it through. I played conservatively, letting others duke it out as the blinds rose. One player, a classic bully, taunted everyone, including me, dragging up my past to get under my skin. I knew the organizers would reprimand him for it, but I confronted him. I let him get away with it, even when he was celebrating each win in an obnoxious way. I just let it roll off my back. I managed to hold on by occasionally taking the blinds. Eventually, it came down to 3 players: the bully, a short stacked guy, and me. The short stack went all in and lost, leaving just me and the bully. Showgirls paraded out trays of $100 chips, creating an impractical but dramatic mountain of cash in the center. Now it was down to 1. Onwards to the next step. The bully upped the ante, crossing the line by calling Meredith a meth head. I told him he could say what he wanted about me, but my family was off limits. He just smirked. I tried to focus, but memories of the Hodge conjecture crept in. He kept taunting me, and I found myself getting distracted, mentally working through equations instead of focusing on the cards. When I managed to take half his chips with a full house, I asked sarcastically if he planned a dance. This only made him angrier. He insulted Meredith again, and I was so angry I nearly launched across the table, causing the game to pause. I looked over at Meredith and Pamela in the audience, who were both visibly upset. I knew I had to keep my cool. I tried to settle my mind by imagining Meredith shuffling cards during our poker lessons. Her motions reminded me of solving equations. I was shaken back to reality by the realization that I hadn't even looked at my cards. There were 5 million. I glanced at Meredith and yelled the conjecture. Her expression shifted as though she understood the weight of that realization. Without looking at my cards, I raised, unnerving the bully. When the flop came, I went all in, still blind to my own hand. I walked over to Meredith, wrapping her in my arms, as the uproar swelled around us. The bully called my bet, and I turned to see that I'd hit a jack. High flush against his straight luck was on my side. The room erupted. And I was finally brought back for the winner's presentation. The bully stormed off, and I gave a few brief remarks, saying that I'd refused the gold champion's bracelet in favor of a paper one that Pamela had made for me. We celebrated in a penthouse suite provided by the casino afterwards. With the win secured, I requested legal pads, pens, and a laptop to start documenting my breakthrough. 3 months later, an article titled "The Solution to Hodge's Conjecture, The Neelan Shift" was published. I co-authored it with. We wrote it together, and the math world was all abuzz. Maggie Marshall and I were awarded $1 million for our contribution. CBS's 60 Minutes featured me as the bad boy math genius in their investigation. They tracked down my accusers from years before, and one of them broke down while the others recanted. They said they felt that Evan Doyle and the dean had coerced them. Doyle had used videotapes to blackmail. The girls even traded grades for sexual favors. The accusers admitted they'd been forced to make false statements against me to retrieve their videos. 60 Minutes aired a clip of Doyle and the dean with the young women, followed by a tearful apology from one accuser asking for my forgiveness. The segment ended with 60 Minutes' iconic ticking watch. After the show, my phone didn't stop ringing. I monitored callers. I ignored the IDs from old friends and colleagues who had abandoned me, only to now express support. Then my parents called, though they'd been quick to judge me in the past. I decided to hear them out. The only person I wanted to speak with was Maggie. We both cried, finally feeling the weight of vindication lift, though it had come at a steep price. The university's board of trustees reached out. They offered me the chance to return, so I flew back with Meredith and Pamela. While we were waiting in the VIP lounge at the airport, I saw Sandra approaching. Even after all these years, her beauty struck me. "Hello, Andy," she said, her voice soft, making my heart skip a beat. "Sandra," I replied, feeling memories flooding back. She paused as if struggling to begin, then admitted, "I thought about crashing that. I was at a trustees event, but Evan, the dean, and I are no longer involved." She looked down at the floor. "Evan's past is catching up with him. Some of his victims came forward, including some from our marriage." She took a deep breath. "I left him. I'm taking my son back home to start over. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking you to consider us. We were so perfect together. I loved you deeply, but when I heard those accusations, I reacted poorly. I know it was wrong, but I just wanted to hurt you back. You'd love my son. He's an amazing little boy. If it's not too late, would you consider giving us another chance? If not, I understand, but I need your forgiveness," I replied. "Sandra, seeing you brings back some happy memories. In a perfect world, we might be able to start over." Her face brightened, "But we're not in a perfect world. Meredith may not have your polish, but she's my partner, is my rock. We're in it together, and I couldn't imagine my life without her." Sandra's face fell as I continued. "I can forgive what you did to me. It led me to Meredith, but I can't forgive how you treated Hank. He loved you like a daughter, and you abandoned him. You didn't come to his funeral or support Maggie. You were part of the lies against him, so I can't give you what you're asking. I hope you and your son find happiness, but without me in the picture." Sandra started to cry when an attendant told her that Miss Nayland and our daughter had already boarded. Sandra's eyes widened when she heard Meredith's maiden name, which I recognized from my research paper. I walked towards the Gulfstream jet, which was a perk from the trustees' event. We were soon cruising at 30,000 feet. After that, I was 3,000 feet up with Pamela, engrossed in her coloring book. I closed my eyes and let go of the last bit of pain from Sandra. Then Pamela gave me a little nudge to get my attention. She showed me her math scribbles and I smiled, confirming her work was spot on. Once she was happy, she went back to her coloring. Meredith was looking for a baby bassinet on her laptop. I closed my eyes for a moment, thinking about how, even though the world is imperfect, finding your soulmate makes every move and every risk worthwhile. Then I felt another gentle nudge from my little girl.